And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Taking a look at today's sea ice analysis, a significant increase in the sea ice here in Nunivak Island and to the west, on down into all of Kuskokwim Bay now, but still Togiak Bay and Bristol Bay, not much in the way of any ice there at all. And it looks like things will continue to increase through tomorrow, but then when that next system comes up from the southwest and those warmer winds come in, then things will start to retreat back to the north again. And for the tonight's forecast, there's that storm I was speaking of out here that pushes eastward into the central Aleutians with snow changing to rain around Adak and Atka and gale force winds. And then higher pressure, lighter wind conditions, still quite an area of light snow out here, but winds diminishing there for the Alaska Peninsula. Winds on the increase now out of the north and northeast here as opposed to south for western Alaska Range, Mananuska-Susitna Valley, Resurrection Bay, north winds on the increase, as well as west winds there for Passage Canal, and also over the Copper River Basin. Cold high pressure holds in the interior, and a system tracks on up into western Canada there, bringing rain along the front, mainly to the southern southeast coast with snow to the north. And for tomorrow, another low tracks into the central southeast coast with looks like mostly snow now across the entire area there. Cold northerly winds here, southeast interior from the Alaska Range southward in toward the Gulf of Alaska, Kodiak Island area. Clear and cold in the interior, out into the northern Bering Sea. And this next storm, the warm front spreading some light snow into at least Nikolsky and the Pribilof Islands in the afternoon with warmer rain over the central Aleutians, changing the showers out to the west. And then for Tuesday, that whole system kind of lifts northward here. Southwest flow and snow makes landfall along the southwest coast with snow and blowing snow. Winter storm watch is out Bristol Bay and the southwest coastal areas up to St. Lawrence Island for the day Thursday. Another system out to the west with rain and gusty winds associated with that. Cold high pressure locked in, at least for now, at least for Thursday, over the Brooks Range there, and keeping it cold and dry over all of interior Alaska, except for the southwest coast there. And low pressure off the southwest coast, cold low pressure, produces a widespread area of snow showers across the panhandle. And for the coastal water forecast, west-northwest winds at 20 to 30 knots on the south coast, gale warnings on the central coast, west-northwest 35 knots, and north to west winds at 15 to 25 for the north coast. Lynn Canal, northwesterlies at 20 knots, south at 15 for Stevens Passage, southeast 25 for Clarence Strait. And for Thursday, gale warnings up here in the north coast for north to northeast winds 25 to 35 knots. And then southwest winds at 15 to 25 knots for the south coast, and Lynn Canal north winds 25 knots, southeast at 15 for Stevens Passage, southeast wind 15 knots for Clarence Strait. Prince William Sound tomorrow, north winds 30 knots, seas 6 feet, same thing for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Gale warnings here for the western North Gulf Coast, north winds 40 knots. Storm warnings here, Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, northwesterlies at 50 to 55. Cook Inlet, north winds 20 to 25 knots. Cook Inlet on Thursday, north winds 20 knots. Gale warnings for Kamishak Bay, northwest 40, about 35 knots out of the northwest for the Barren Islands. And north winds here for the North Gulf Coast at 30 to 40 knots with Prince William Sound looking at a north wind at 25. Kodiak Island tomorrow, northwest winds 35 to 50 knots with the storm warnings there in Shelikof Strait. And for the Alaska Peninsula, north to northwest winds 15 to 25 knots. Bristol Bay, northwest at 25 knots. And then for the Alaska Peninsula on Thursday, we've got south to southwesterlies at 25 knots there. Northeast at 15 for Bristol Bay and Kodiak Island. Northwest winds 25 to 30 knots. Eastern Aleutians, south to east winds at 25 to 35 knots tomorrow with the gales from Nikolsky to Shimianatu, where they're expecting southerlies at 40 knots. Western Aleutians, south winds 20 to 30 knots. Western Aleutians on Thursday, for areas west of Kiska, east winds at 30 knots. From Chitka Island, south to southeast winds 35 to 40 knots. Adak and Atka, south winds 40 knots, and south winds 30 to 35 knots for the eastern Aleutians. And moving to the Bering Sea here for the Pribilof Islands, southeast winds 30. Strong gales out of the east at 45 knots for St. Matthew Island ahead of that front, and north winds at 20 knots for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. Northwesterlies of 15 to 20 knots for the Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, and Norton Sound. They'll swing around to the east up that way on Thursday with Norton Sound at about 20 knots. St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta coast looking at 30-knot winds. East at 35 knots, so gale warnings for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. Southerly gales for the Pribilof Islands with those seas up to 16 feet and 45 knots southeast winds for St. Matthew Island. Brisk wind advisories for the eastern Boulevard Sea coast tomorrow. West winds at 25 knots. Central and western coast, west at 15 knots, and the Chukchi Sea northwesterlies at 20. And then on Thursday, the Chukchi Sea, the winds change direction, drop off a little bit, running east to southeast at 10 to 15 knots. Otherwise, for the central and western Arctic coast, west winds at 15 knots and brisk wind advisories for the eastern Boulevard Sea coast for 25 to 30 knot winds.